Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
Mountain lions are an incredibly charismatic animal on landscapes within and adjacent to the national park system, but they're seldom seen because of their nocturnal tendencies. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. There recently was a new report that focused on a comprehensive estimate of mountain lions in California, and the number is much smaller than many had thought it was. To discuss California's mountain lion population and efforts to protect that population, our guest today is Dr. Veronica Yovovich, a conservation scientist at Panthera, the global wildcat conservation organization. We'll be back in a minute with Dr. Yovovich.
The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life is a biannual magazine produced by Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokeysinformation.org.
Welcome to the Traveler, Veronica.
Thank you.
You know, it's great to have you here, and mountain lions are, one of those charismatic megafauna that a lot of people seem really interested in. And, this latest report that the mountain lion population in California is not as big as people had thought it was, that's kind of alarming. I mean, what are the latest numbers?
Yeah, so previously, people thought that the numbers were somewhere in the 5,000 to 7,000 range, I believe, and it's been downgraded to between 3,200 and 4,500. So that's significantly lower than previous estimates that were based on habitat availability. And these new numbers are based on much finer scale research.
Has the habitat decreased?
Earlier, we thought that the state of California had somewhere on the order of 6,000 mountain lions. And new research suggests the number is actually closer to 3,200 to 4,500 mountain lions. So that's significantly lower than we previously thought.
And is that primarily due to loss of habitat?
Yeah, so a lot of that is because the previous model was based on habitat suitability. So the state researchers looked at the habitat that was available and estimated puma density according to how much space there was. The new data that has come out more recently is much finer resolution. So they used a lot more nuanced tools to make that estimate. And certainly there's a lot less habitat available to mountain lions than there used to be.
Yeah.
The mountain lions need large open spaces that are relatively free of human development. They're not wilderness obligates, but they need open spaces with no development or very low density human development to survive. And so as our human population expands, which it is in California, it's growing quite a lot, that shrinks the habitat that's available for mountain lions.
Yeah, I was just wondering how adaptable they are. I mean, I live in northern Utah, the Park City area, and certainly, there's lots of forested areas around where we live, but in the wintertime, heavy snows, the deer come down, and there have been a number of people in the general vicinity where I live whose, Ring doorbells or their trail cameras have picked up lions walking through their backyards, past their front porches.
Yeah, this is one of the really interesting things about studying mountain lions now is it's really changed from how we used to do it a few decades ago. Because we have things like Ring cameras and really good wildlife cameras, so those motion sensitive camera traps that researchers deploy out in the field, we have a much better ability to observe and interact indirectly with animals like mountain lions in ways that we couldn't in the past. And so in some ways, from a human perspective, it seems like the mountain lion population is growing because there's more people, so there's higher chances of people interacting with whatever mountain lions are out there because we have more sort of mountain lion detectors in these humans out on the landscape. And we have the ability to observe them when we aren't there with ring cameras and wildlife cameras. And so we have a lot more ability to interact, whether that's directly or indirectly. And those indirect detections and interactions are really increasing with the technology that we have to observe them. Now, on top of that, we also have social media. And so when anybody observes a mountain lion, you can send that information around immediately. And so everybody vicariously has that indirect interaction. So those things combined make it seem like the population is really changing in a way that the biology probably doesn't support.
Yeah, interesting. California is a big state. Did the latest research in calculating the population show any pockets where there are greater populations of lions than previously, or areas where the populations have flattened out? I mean, you look across the Sierra Nevada or the Mojave Desert,
Right. So in the Mojave, they didn't detect. There were areas where they didn't detect any mountain lions, but in other places like Humboldt County, the population is actually doing quite well. Those are some of the higher areas for mountain lions.
What about the Sequoia, Kings Canyon, Yosemite National Park areas?
That's a good question. I'm sure that the research would have something to say about that. I don't know specifically about those areas based on my experience going to those places. I would say that there's good habitat for them there. So I would be surprised. And you've got those large protected areas that should make it even better habitat for mountain lions. So they should do pretty well there.
I wonder if you would run into problems with overlap of territories and interspecies aggression.
Yeah, and in places where the mountain lion population is doing really well, you'll start to see some self-regulation in the population where territories will butt up against one another, and you can see conspecific strife. So mountain lions fighting other mountain lions, or you can see things like infanticide, where a male comes in and kills off his neighboring male's offspring, or you'll see decreases in birth rates, and that's how mountain lions equilibrate their population with what the habitat can actually hold.
Yeah, yeah, interesting stuff. Now, you'd mentioned earlier that part of the problem is loss of habitat, human population. We keep spreading out and ruining all these beautiful places. What about natural disasters like the recent wildfires that have been in the news in California in the past 2 or 3 years? Are they detrimental to lion habitat, or do the lions just cope with it?
That's a very good question. On an evolutionary timescale, mountain lions did co-evolve with forest fire. They live in a lot of different environments where fire is a natural part of the system, and so they have tools to deal with fires. And some of those tools could be shifting their habitat use to move into an area that's not currently burning while a fire burns through another part of their home range. Sometimes they'll move out of their home range altogether and go to a place that's safer, or they can dodge the fire on a micro scale as it burns through. Now, with fire as it is now, we have these giant mega fires, which is not what they evolved for. So, certainly, that can be really detrimental to them in a bunch of different ways. It can displace them into areas that aren't burning where people live, and then you can see an increase in human wildlife conflict, or it can burn important resources that their prey need, and so there's definitely repercussions. They can also be in the path of the fire themselves
Hmm.
and perish that way. um, we've seen, this is getting a little grim, but we've seen pumas that have walked through burned areas and will burn their paws
Right.
and
Right.
be
I've heard
injured
that.
that way. And it's a very different environment from how they evolved, and definitely causes problems for them.
Now, when you're talking about a drop in population of an apex predator, how does that affect the food chain, so to speak, downhill? I mean, in Yellowstone, you go back to the early 1900s, and wolves are bad and grizzly bears are bad, and we're going to kill them out. And part of the response was, burgeoning elk herds or burgeoning, mule deer herds. Have we seen any of that related to the mountain lion population decrease in California?
Yeah, it hasn't been studied quite so clearly as the Yellowstone model, but there was a paper that was published just a couple of years ago that explored lots of different ecological implications for mountain lion loss. It explored a lot of different biological relationships that center around mountain lion activity, and so you see some of the same issues that we've seen in Yellowstone, where mountain lions influence their prey, and there are influences that trickle down through the environment. Some of my dissertation work looked at how humans displace mountain lions, and that influences where deer browse. And what we saw was that deer spend more time in places with humans, using humans as a shield against predation, and browse down the plants in those human adjacent areas. And that can actually change the plant architecture. So plants that grow farther away from humans, where there's more puma activity, more mountain lion activity, are less browsed. And so they grow longer and more sort of attenuated, like taller. Whereas plants near humans, where the pumas have been displaced and the deer browse more, are stumpier with denser branches because they have higher herbivory pressure. The deer are browsing on them more, and stunting their growth. And for people who live in those areas with deer, like the urban wildland adjacent areas, have probably noticed sort of pyramid shaped bushes where they're heavily browsed by deer. Or sometimes you can notice on oak trees, well, there'll be a line about 6 feet tall where all the branches under 6 feet tall have been browsed off. And then the tree grows as a tree normally would above that browse line.
That's pretty interesting. I'm going to mention a book. You've probably heard about it, being in Fort Collins, Beast in the Garden. It's probably been a decade or so since it came out. It was a case study out of Boulder, Colorado, I believe, where you had all these homeowners and they wanted beautiful gardens and trees and vegetation, and so they planted all this stuff, and of course that brought the deer down into the Boulder neighborhoods, and where the prey is, the predator will follow. And so you had mountain lion, at least one mountain lion, come down, and a young teenager was killed, unfortunately, while out on a training run. Are we seeing that in California? We're talking about a decrease in habitat, and so are they coming down across that urban interface, that wild urban interface into urban areas?
This is another really interesting question. And there's a research group out of UC Santa Cruz that's studying just that. So this group at UC Santa Cruz is looking at human mountain lion interactions in the Bay Area, and whether we can use behavioral modification to segregate human activity and mountain lion activity. And what I mean by that is they're studying space use, puma space use in open space preserves, so protected habitat, and whether they can use adversive conditioning to encourage pumas to use areas away from high human activity areas. So what they're doing is they're trying to train the mountain lions to stay away from places that people frequent.
Sure.
Because that is something that we're wondering about. There are, in general, you don't see a lot of human mountain lion interactions, right? It's very different from others. They are very different from other species. Like you can go to Yellowstone and see wolves. You can see grizzlies, elk, bison, all sorts of critters. But there's really nowhere in the US where you can go and view mountain lions, right? They're a much more cryptic species in general. So they're There are places, there are very small hotspots where you do tend to see a bit more human mountain lion interactions. Boulder is one of those places. There's some areas in Southern California where there have been a couple incidents with mountain lions, and there's a spot in the Bay Area where there have been a couple incidents. It's not a ton, but there have been more than you would expect and more than you see in other places. And so what
Yeah.
they're studying is whether there's tools, what kinds of tools we can use to train mountain lions to stay away from people, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting. I digress a bit. But a year and a half, 2 years ago, we were down in northern New Mexico working on some stories, and we got into the Santa Fe National Forest after sundown, and we were driving to a campground. This was late October, early November, and a mountain lion walked in front of our car. It was just pretty cool. You don't see that too often.
You don't, and I do get to hear a lot of mountain lion sighting stories. Working on mountain lions, you definitely pull those out of people, and most of the stories go the same way, where somebody saw a mountain lion, they weren't sure what it was until they saw the tail, until they saw the back end, because the mountain lion was running away from them. And
Yeah.
that is how the vast majority of interactions go. It's, they are cats, and so they are inherently idiosyncratic, but most of the interactions end with the mountain lion running away. And actually, there was a research project done years ago by two puma researchers who worked on mountain lions all over the American West. And they have a lot of close encounters where they were tracking mountain lions. And so they were able to document their experiences cheating, right? They had collars on the mountain lions and they were hiking to them to see what they were up to do their research. And they were able to document something like 281 close quarters interactions with human groups ranging from 2 to 8. And what they found was the vast majority of the time, the puma ran away.
Yeah.
There were some times when the puma did, the sort of cat thing where it's just sat there and looked at them, right? In that same way that your house cat will do. But in none of those interactions did they get attacked, right? There's the chances of getting attacked are very, very low. Even if the cat doesn't run away, which is what's going to happen most of the time, usually it just sort of sits there and looks at you until you make an exit.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in our situation, it just kind of walked across the road right, in front of us, had a collar on. We could see that, saw a long tail, and he just disappeared into the forest. Very cool sighting. This is Kurt Repenchek with National Parks Traveler. We're talking today with Dr. Veronica Yovovich, a conservation scientist at Panthera, the global wildcat conservation organization. We're talking about mountain lions in California and recent studies that show a decline in population. We're going to take a short break, and I'll be right back.
Listener and reader support make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org. Gear up for 2024 with Interior Federal Credit Union. Synchronize all your accounts in one place with their tool, Money Management. Money Management allows you to create budgets to fit your lifestyle, set up goals for the future, monitor your account and loan balances with one login, track debt, and more. Apply for membership at interiorfcu.org and sign up for digital banking to get started. Federally insured by NCUA.
So, Veronica, in terms of the decline in California, is any of it related to livestock predation, where the rancher, the farmer, is trying to protect his herds?
Yeah, certainly that is a big issue for mountain lions. So in California, up until recently, I should back up. So Californians decided to protect mountain lions, even though mountain lions are designated a least concern species. So they're common, they're not threatened. Californians valued having an apex predator on their landscape and wanted to make sure that mountain lions remained in perpetuity. So they passed Prop 117 that protected mountain lions and removed or made it so that we couldn't hunt them, so that it's illegal to shoot them for any reason unless they threaten your personal safety or the safety of your livestock and companion animals. Now, within that, there's that space made for livestock producers who need to protect their livestock, and people do use those permits, that permission, to protect their livestock. And on average, about 100 pumas are killed every year under what's called those depredation permits. Now, in 2020, I believe, the Center for Biological Diversity and a bunch of other groups petitioned for mountain lions to receive protected status. And once that petition was submitted, they received basically endangered species protections in certain distinct population segments in California. So in the Santa Ana Mountains and the Santa Monica Mountains and the Santa Cruz Mountains, those areas were identified as places where the population is shrinking and in danger of going locally extinct. And so
Right, I
in
believe
those
within 50 years.
for they tied that specifically to the Southern California population. That's right.
Right.
And so those areas get special protections now. And so in those areas, the strategy is to help prevent conflict before it happens, really, which we should be doing anywhere that mountain lions and livestock coexist, right?
Yeah.
But there's a special focus in those areas.
So what's being done to help the livestock producers protect their livestock from the mountain lions?
There's some neat research projects that are popping up to help the state agency have science-based information to give to livestock producers. So not a lot of research has been done on livestock protection and mountain lions specifically. So we've got our new Panthera-based research project called BayClip, the Bay Area Carnivore Livestock Interactions Project, that is focused on the Central Coast and is testing different livestock protection tools to help ranchers know what tools are effective, in what context they're effective, and how to best deploy them, so that when the California Department of Fish and Wildlife folks go in after there's been an incident, or if for a livestock producer that's concerned about livestock protection issues, and we can help arm them with good information to help those producers most effectively. And we also work with extension to get the message out to relevant livestock producers.
And I believe there's some new tools that have come out, Fox lights and turbo flodry installations. What are those?
These are some of the promising tools. Livestock guardian dogs are a very old tool that seem to be very effective. And then there's new tools like Fox lights. So these are these devices that, as the name would suggest, were developed to reduce fox predation, but may work on other species as well. It's a light that you set out in your grazing areas. You can put them on the perimeter of your fence and have a string of like multiple lights set up. And they go on at dusk, so at sundown, and are active all night until the sun comes back up again, which is, of course, when carnivores are most active. And they flash randomly colored lights in random directions at random intervals. And the idea here is that carnivores in general don't like novel environments. They don't like new things. And so this light is a completely foreign, new, unpleasant stimulus that discourages them from coming into a certain area.
And the turbo flodry, what is that?
The turbo flagray is also a new twist on a very old tool. So it's a line of polywire, like a cord of polywire that's electrified, with these flags that hang down, these rectangular flags at regular intervals. I think it's around 11 inches between flags, and they flap in the breeze and again create that sort of novel, unpleasant psychological barrier. And the cord itself is electrified. So if a puma or a coyote decides to test, they get used to the flags themselves and they decide to test that boundary, and they explore the world in general, sort of nose first, then they'll get a non-injurious but unpleasant shock when they try and investigate that flagray. And it's an interesting story because it's a really old tool that used to be used for wolf hunting in Europe. And what they would do is they'd string up fladry that wasn't electrified, just plain old fladry, and they'd funnel wolves through. And then as the wolves came out the funnel end, they would kill them. And so it's a neat tool that's been turned on its head, and now it's being used to protect wolves and livestock.
Is one more effective than the other, the Fox lights versus the flood ray installations?
That's exactly what our research is trying to figure out. I have a feeling that tools that actually deliver a penalty for trespass. So, like the turbo fladry has that electrified, unpleasant component, will probably be more effective than something like a flashing light. But but that's one of the things we're going to figure out with this research project.
Yeah, interesting. Although I wonder, will you have to deal with breaks in the line? I know my
Yeah, every
father-in-law.
tool, right. Every tool will have its own limitations, its own investment that you have to make, whether that's financial or time, time setting up in the first place and maintaining it. They all have their own benefits and drawbacks. And really the best protected livestock will probably have some sort of combination of tools or tools that rotate through, because carnivores are out there 24/7, and they're very smart, and they learn about what's going on in their landscape. So you'll probably have to shift things on them so that they don't get too used to any one tool.
Yeah, yeah. And now a little earlier, you'd mentioned about the cat population in the Santa Monica and the Santa Ana mountains, and the projection that if nothing is done, that there's a 1 in 4 chance that the mountain lions could be extinct in those areas. Do we know exactly or close to exactly how many mountain lions are in the Santa Monica Mountains population?
I'm not sure. The researchers who work down in that area specifically probably have a pretty good idea of what that number is, but I'm afraid I don't know what that is.
Yeah, I know there's been a lot of concern in recent years, in part because of the wildfires that have swept through the Santa Monica Mountains and the NRA down there, the National Recreation Area. But of course, the presence of the 101 freeway that comes down there and the impediment it poses for lions trying to explore new territories or just move about in the surrounding territories.
Yeah, the mountain lions living in Southern California have multiple threats, right? So they've got habitat loss from development. They've got a lot of high speed, hard to cross roads that crisscross a lot of Southern California. They've got wildfires and those mega fires that pose a threat. They also have there's a lot of rodenticide down there,
Right,
which
right.
is a huge threat. And so with all of those multiple threats going on, you see pockets of mountain lions that are becoming isolated from one another and suffer from inbreeding depression, right? So there's a lot of different forces working against mountain lions in Southern California.
Yeah. Any prediction on how the Wallace Annenberg Wildlife Crossing Wildlife Bridge over the 101 will impact lion populations in that area? I mean, there's lots of millions of dollars going into building that. At the same time, there's that 1 in 4 chance that the cats could be extinct in 50 years. Would that wildlife bridge be a big help to lion populations down in that region?
It could make all the difference. It could make all the difference between extinction and perseverance. So, in general, it doesn't actually take that much gene flow to keep a population viable. I don't know what the exact number for that is in Southern California, but for other places, it's been something on the order of one animal moving between populations and successfully reproducing every couple years, right?
Hmm.
It doesn't need to be, it doesn't need to create a whole new wildlife highway to make a huge difference. So I would think that wildlife crossing structure could be a wonderful boon to the population there.
Yeah, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that goes. Can we cross the country to southern Florida and talk for just a few minutes about the Florida panther situation down there?
Sure.
I know it's been a great problem for many years. You could go back to when they were so concerned about inbreeding problems that they brought in some mountain lions or cougars, depending on your vernacular, from Texas to help improve the gene flow. But ever since then, the population has, been kind of hanging around 200 individuals, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. The Fish and Wildlife Service has never really designated critical habitat in South Florida for Florida panthers. We've got road collisions that are killing the panthers every year. There's some interspecies aggression because the habitat is so squeezed. Can you tell us anything about the outlook for the Florida panther?
Yeah, the main way that I use the Florida panther in my own work in California is as a cautionary tale. So the Florida panther is a really interesting case study because this is a population of mountain lions that was always there. It's not a reintroduced population; it's a remnant population, and it's become more and more and more isolated. Mountain lions used to be widespread across the entirety of the U.S. And that is their only population that remains in the East Coast. And the nearest neighboring population is actually in Texas. And like you mentioned, when the population had gotten down to, I think, around 100 individuals and was really suffering from inbreeding depression, so the buildup of unfortunate genes in that small population, they were seeing health issues like kinked tails and heart defects and defective sperm. And so they brought a puma in from the closest population from Texas, let her have a couple litters of kittens, and that was enough to sort of reset the genetic stock in Florida and help rescue that population. But yeah, I mean, what it really needs is to be a part of a connected neighboring population in order to be able to really survive and be self perpetuating in perpetuity. So that the population really, it is quite small, and that cautionary tale element is a parallel for what could happen in these populations in California. So in the Santa Cruz Mountains or the Santa Anas or the Santa Monicas, you can look to Florida for what happens when the population gets isolated like that. As for the Florida population itself, it's going to take a lot of management in order to keep those critters on the map.
Right. We're talking about expansion of territory or connecting two different populations. It wasn't too many years ago, I believe, that the eastern mountain lion in the New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York area, I believe, was declared extinct. That no longer existed. And so while from time to time there are dispersers from that Florida panther population going north, there's nothing up there for them to go to.
Yeah, and so this is somewhat encouraging that the eastern front of the western population of mountain lions does seem to be expanding east, right? So we're seeing more individuals leave the western population and strike out east to see what they can find, and the population could potentially recover itself. It could recolonize on its own as long as we don't get in their way, basically. Yeah. We at Panthera, we published a paper recently that identified habitat patches on the East Coast that would be suitable for mountain lion recolonization. So these are areas that are sufficiently large to have a self-sustaining population for some period of time. There's sufficient prey, there's low enough human density, and by that I mean roads and houses and livestock. And there are actually quite a number of good habitat patches that, if mountain lions could make their way east, could potentially set up populations and recolonize the east, which would be very exciting.
Yeah. Are there lions moving down from Canada into the New England or northern New York areas?
They could. There are a bunch of different places where they could move from neighboring populations, and up from Canada is an option. From the Black Hills is where some of those dispersing individuals have come from. Anywhere along that eastern front, there are places where mountain lions could make their way back into the Midwest and East Coast.
Now, here's the devil's advocate question. why do we need panthers? Why should we be concerned about mountain lion populations?
Yeah, and that's a very fair question. And there's lots of different answers depending on your sensibility. So one is that animals have an intrinsic right to exist, and that in its own right should be enough. Also, they play a really important ecological role in regulating prey numbers and all the trickle down effects that happen from their interactions with other species. So, if we want to get into the nitty gritty of it, so pumas can help regulate prey, and we've seen what happens when you remove all of the apex carnivores on the East Coast, right? You see that deer populations go through the roof, and
Right.
we're seeing a lot more automobile collisions with people. So there's a human safety issue there that mountain lions could help with. There's also disease issues that, because of the different interactions between mountain lions and their prey and the species that they compete with. So with coyotes and how those relationships play out, where we're seeing higher incidence of things like Lyme disease that we can trace back to losing those apex carnivores. So there's some selfish reasons that we should want mountain lions on the landscape for our own personal safety, as well as preserving important ecological relationships.
Yeah. Is climate change in the Southwest particularly impacting the lions? I'm just wondering with the hotter temperatures, certainly the drought that the Southwest has been in for the last 20 years or so.
Yeah, mountain lions are they are the most widely distributed mammal in the Western Hemisphere. So they range all the way from about halfway through Canada, all the way down to the southern tip of South America. And they occupy most types of habitats within that huge range. So, so mountain lions don't make a great poster child for the impacts of climate change in general. But at the extremes, we do expect that we would see some negative impacts of climate change. So desert environments are certainly one of those where mountain lions historically have existed in low population density, but with droughts, we could expect that we might lose them from those areas where their prey are being affected, and so they can't survive. And like we were talking about earlier with megafires, that's going to play a role. They're also limited by snow depth. So as snow patterns change, that could influence where mountain lions can live. Now that's just looking at the biology, but when you layer in and you factor in climate change with human wildlife conflict, that's where we could see real issues with mountain lions being able to persist, because climate change is going to influence their habitat use on a local scale that could drive them into places where they have increased conflict with people, and that can really dramatically reduce their population.
Sure. I'm wondering if warmer temperatures are impacting the cats. I mean, we're talking about mountain lions, but also in the news recently, there have been reports of jaguars coming up from Mexico into southern Texas, I think, and Arizona.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So warmer temperatures can have a lot of different influences, and depending on if you're talking about like warmer temperatures causing droughts, like in the Southwest, that can certainly play a role. Warmer temperatures can also expand the range of mountain lion competitors. So if jaguars expand their range into places where jaguars haven't been before, you could see competition between those two species that could change the population dynamics.
Definitely something to watch for. It'd be interesting. That's Dr. Veronica Yovovich from Panthera, a global wildcat conservation organization, talking about mountain lions across the country. Veronica, it's been great to have you today. I really appreciate your insights and look forward to see how some of those tools out in California help mountain lion populations.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. The next time you're in a national park in the West or South Florida or Texas, keep your eyes peeled right around sunrise or sundown to see if you might spot one of these big cats. Next week, we're discussing the ongoing recovery work with giant sequoia forests in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks with the Executive Director of the Sequoia Parks Conservancy. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchak. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.